Have you ever, like, cringed when someone touched you?
Oh, yeah.
Like, it wasn't even a mean touch, but you just, like,
Yeah.
really didn't want to be touched?
Mhm.
That's what we're looking at today. It's called tactile defensiveness, and it's something that a lot of folks on the autism spectrum experience, and it can be really tough to deal with, especially when you don't even realize what's going on.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to unpack all of that today, figure out what it is, why it happens, and what we can do to help. Our main source for this deep dive is an article from Cheap ABA called Understanding Autism and Tactile Defensiveness. Super interesting read. One of the things that really stood out to me was how a simple touch can actually trigger memories of past discomfort or even pain, especially for kids. It makes you realize how important it is to be respectful of boundaries.
Absolutely. Trauma-informed care is so important.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into that, let's start with the basics. What exactly is tactile defensiveness?
Well, it's like, when certain textures or touch sensations just feel super intense, even painful. And it's not just a matter of personal preference. It's like their sensory system is processing those sensations differently, like turning up the volume on everything.
So it's not that they're being picky or dramatic, it's a genuine, like, physical experience.
Exactly.
The article had some really vivid examples that kind of brought this to life. You want to share a couple of those?
Sure. Imagine that little tag on the back of your shirt. You know the one. Most people don't even notice it. But for someone with tactile defensiveness, it can feel like sandpaper grating against their skin.
Ouch. Yeah, that doesn't sound fun.
Or think about a friendly pat on the back. To some, that could feel like a really hard shove.
Wow. I'm starting to see how everyday interactions could become a minefield.
Absolutely. And it can manifest in different ways, too.
Yeah, the article talked about that. It's not just about hating certain fabrics.
Right. Like you said, it's not just disliking things, it's a real aversion. They might avoid certain textures altogether, like refusing to wear clothes with certain fabrics, or completely steering clear of things like sand at the beach or Play-Doh.
Yeah, I can see how that would make certain activities pretty much impossible.
It can be really isolating.
So that's like the avoidance piece. What were some of the other ways it shows up?
Well, there's the overreaction to light touch, which we touched on with the pat on the back example. Something like a hug or a tap on the shoulder, which most people would find comforting, could be totally overwhelming for someone with tactile defensiveness.
It's like their personal bubble is extra sensitive.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into the third category, which is discomfort with personal space. You know that feeling when someone's standing a little too close for comfort? Imagine feeling that all the time, even in normal social situations.
Oh, wow. So it's like a constant invasion of their space.
Yeah.
No wonder it can lead to anxiety.
Ex-
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture of how tactile defensiveness shows up. But the big question is, why? What's happening in the brain that's causing these intense reactions?
The article breaks it down into three main reasons, all related to how the brain processes sensory information.
Let's dive into those one by one.
Okay, the first one is sensory processing differences. In a lot of autistic individuals, their brain actually experiences sensory input way more intensely than neurotypical folks. It's like that volume knob we talked about earlier. Everything's turned up to 11.
So it's not just in their heads, their brains are literally wired differently.
Precisely.
Okay, fascinating. What about the second reason?
The second one is past negative experiences. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. A touch that seems totally harmless in the present can trigger memories of past discomfort, kind of like a flashback.
That makes you think twice about every interaction, especially with kids.
It really does. Asking for consent, respecting boundaries, it's all crucial. You never know what kind of baggage someone might be carrying.
Right, and a seemingly small thing could have a huge impact.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got sensory processing differences and past experiences. What's the third piece of the puzzle?
The third one is the role of anxiety and stress. You know how when you're already stressed out, your senses seem heightened, like everything's just too much?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, for someone with tactile defensiveness, that feeling's magnified tenfold. The article actually describes it as living in a constant state of sensory overload. So you can imagine how even the slightest touch can feel unbearable.
Wow, I'm starting to get a sense of just how challenging this must be. It's not just about being picky or oversensitive, it's a whole different way of experiencing the world.
Exactly, and it's something that often goes unnoticed or misunderstood.
Yeah, and I bet that lack of understanding can lead to a lot of frustration and isolation. But now that we're starting to understand what tactile defensiveness is and why it happens, maybe we can start to figure out how to help.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. What can we do to support those who are struggling with this?
That's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
You know, something that really stood out in that cheap ABA article was how much it emphasized respecting individual differences.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, what might be fine for one person could be a total nightmare for someone else.
Right, and that's so important to keep in mind with tactile defensiveness.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
And that's why communication is so important.
Absolutely. Always ask before giving a hug or a pat on the back.
Yeah, you never know how someone's going to react.
And be prepared to respect their wishes if they say no or seem uncomfortable.
Because it's not about being polite, it's about respecting their boundaries.
It's about recognizing that their experience is valid.
And that their sensory system might be processing things differently.
Exactly.
The article talked about how tough everyday things like getting dressed or bathing can be for kids with tactile sensitivities.
Oh, yeah. Those can be major hurdles.
Because something as simple as putting on a shirt could feel like a sensory overload.
Absolutely. If you're sensitive to certain fabrics or textures,
It can be really overwhelming.
and that's where patience and empathy come in.
Yeah, meeting them where they're at
Working with them to find solutions.
instead of forcing them to conform.
Exactly. Like letting them choose softer clothing.
Giving them more time to get dressed.
Maybe using visual timers to help them anticipate transitions.
Those are all great tips.
Little things like that can make a world of difference.
The article also mentioned occupational therapy as a potential resource.
Oh, yeah. Occupational therapy can be incredibly helpful.
In what way?
Well, an occupational therapist can do a thorough assessment to identify what specific sensory challenges the person is facing.
So it's not just generic advice,
No, it's tailored to their individual needs.
like a personalized plan.
Exactly. They might use sensory integration therapy.
What's
It's where they carefully expose the person to different sensory experiences in a controlled environment.
so they can gradually get used to them?
Right. And they also teach coping mechanisms like deep breathing exercises or progressive muscle relaxation.
To help manage anxiety and sensory overload.
Exactly. It's about giving them the tools to navigate their world more effectively.
You know, as we're talking about all this, I'm thinking about all the misconceptions surrounding tactile defensiveness.
Oh, there are a lot of those.
What are some of the biggest ones you've come across?
One of the biggest is that people with tactile defensiveness are just being difficult.
Or oversensitive.
Yeah, like they're choosing to be this way.
But that's not the case at all.
No, their reactions are real.
It's a genuine response to discomfort.
It's not about being manipulative or attention-seeking.
It's about their sensory system sending them a very clear signal that something is wrong.
Right, and another myth is that they could just snap out of it.
Like it's a matter of willpower.
Exactly. But as we've discussed, it's often rooted in neurological differences.
And can be connected to past experiences or anxiety.
It's not something you can just will away.
It's about understanding and accommodation,
Creating a safe and supportive environment.
where they feel respected and understood.
Exactly.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It really has.
It's made me realize how much I still need to learn.
We all do.
But beyond just understanding tactile defensiveness, I think there's a bigger takeaway here about empathy
Oh, absolutely.
and awareness in all of our interactions.
Being mindful of the fact that everyone experiences the world differently.
That what might seem normal to us could be really challenging for someone else.
And that it's our responsibility to be sensitive to those differences
To approach each other with curiosity and openness.
instead of judgment or dismissal.
To ask, how can I support you? Instead of, what's wrong with you?
Those are such important shifts in perspective.
We've talked about the individual experience and ways to support those with tactile defensiveness.
But now I'm thinking about the bigger picture.
Me too.
How can we make the world a more sensory-friendly place?
That's a great question.
Because we're constantly interacting with different environments.
Our homes, workplaces, public spaces.
And so many of those spaces are designed without any consideration for sensory sensitivities.
It's like we're unintentionally creating barriers.
For people who experience the world differently.
So what can we do about that?
Well, that's where sensory inclusivity comes in.
What does that mean?
It's about designing spaces that are welcoming to everyone, regardless of their sensory needs.
So, like, what would that look like?
It could be things like having quiet areas in public spaces,
Using softer lighting?
choosing muted colors instead of bright ones.
Having clear signage and predictable layouts?
Anything that can help reduce anxiety and sensory overload.
Those are all great ideas.
It's about making small but impactful changes.
That can make a big difference.
And it's not just limited to public spaces.
Right, we can do this in our homes too.
And in our workplaces.
Creating sensory-friendly corners.
Advocating for accommodations.
Like noise-canceling headphones or flexible seating.
It's all about being mindful and proactive.
Designing spaces that are truly inclusive.
For everyone.
I love that idea.
It's about recognizing that everyone has different needs.
And that we can create environments that meet those needs.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
It's been great.
It's really made me think about the world in a new way.
More aware of the sensory experiences of those around us.
And more committed to advocating for inclusivity.
For everyone.
Well said.
This is a topic that deserves more attention.
I agree.
And I hope our conversation today has inspired some folks to learn more.
Me too. You know, it's funny because we've been talking so much about individual experiences with tactile defensiveness.
Right.
But it's got me thinking about the bigger picture, like the spaces we occupy every day,
Yeah.
our homes, workplaces, even just like public transportation.
It's true.
Are those environments really designed with sensory sensitivities in mind?
That's a great question. And I think a lot of times the answer is no.
Right. It's almost like we're unintentionally setting people up for sensory overload.
Yeah, because these spaces are often filled with potential triggers.
Harsh lighting, loud noises, crowds, unpredictable textures, the list goes on.
Exactly. And that's where the concept of sensory inclusivity comes in.
Sensory inclusivity, what is that?
It's basically designing spaces that are welcoming and accessible to everyone, regardless of their sensory processing needs.
So it's not just about making things comfortable for people with tactile defensiveness.
No, it's about creating environments that work for everyone.
I like that a lot.
Because we all have different sensory preferences.
Right.
Some people are more sensitive to noise, others to light, others to touch.
And a truly inclusive space would take all of those differences into account.
Exactly.
So what would that look like in practice? How can we make these spaces more sensory friendly?
Well, for starters, we could offer quiet areas in public spaces.
Like little sensory retreats.
Exactly, a place where people can go to decompress if they're feeling overwhelmed.
I love that.
We could also use softer lighting, more muted colors.
Instead of those harsh fluorescent.
Yeah, and clear signage, predictable layouts.
So people know what to expect.
And can navigate the space more easily.
It all comes down to being more mindful of the sensory experience, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And making those small but impactful changes that can make a big difference.
And it's not just about public spaces either.
Right. We can do this in our homes, too.
Create sensory-friendly corners, offer a variety of seating options, use blackout curtains if needed.
What about workplaces?
Same thing. We can advocate for sensory accommodations like noise-canceling headphones or flexible work arrangements.
So people can work in an environment that supports their needs.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been incredible.
It really has.
It opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about the world.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's not just about tactile defensiveness. It's about recognizing that everyone experiences the world differently.
And that we need to create spaces that honor those differences.
Exactly. Spaces that are welcoming and inclusive for everyone. Well, dear listeners, we hope you found this deep dive as insightful and inspiring as we did.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From understanding what tactile defensiveness is,
To exploring practical strategies for support.
and even reimagining our environments to be more sensory inclusive.
It's been quite a journey.
And we hope it sparks some new ideas and perspectives for you.
Because ultimately, it's all about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected.
No matter how they experience the world.
Exactly.
As you go about your day to day, we encourage you to think about the sensory landscape of your surroundings.
Notice the things that might be challenging for someone with sensory sensitivities.
And think about how those spaces could be made more accommodating.
Even small changes can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
So let's all do our part to create a more sensory inclusive world.
It's a world that benefits everyone.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
See